Hi, I'm Andrea and welcome back to my channel. It has been a hot minute since I've talked about language learning on this channel. It's wild because I feel like this is one of two categories that I like to talk about the most usually, which is language learning and travel versus like writing and books. It's been a while since I felt inspired to talk about this on my channel, and there's probably a million reasons for this that maybe I don't even fully understand, but I think mainly it was because I wasn't actively learning a new language for quite a while. I was still speaking French all the time, almost every day. I was listening to French probably every day because I watch videos in French, I talk to my in-laws in French, I read stuff online in French, but I don't necessarily practice French all the time anymore. And even though when I was in New York I really wanted to work on my Spanish, I think I even said that in one of my videos, it did not happen to the extent that I wanted it to. Lately, I have restarted my Spanish. I'm just doing a little bit of Duolingo here and there, and I'm trying to watch more videos a bit more consciously, choosing to watch Spanish more often. And on top of that, I have started tinkering with a little bit of Portuguese. I'm not learning it with an intent to be fluent or anything like that. I really was just curious about the language, and I know that in many ways it is similar to Spanish and French, and I was just kind of curious. The topic today is a little bit adjacent to actual language learning. I don't want to talk about things that you can do to practice your languages. Of course, some of these hobbies you can, and I might mention that in passing as I talk about the different things that I have on this list. But what I really want to talk about is more so the brain development and the sort of mindset that I have and have had going into language learning. And these other hobbies that I do, these other interests that I have, the other passions in my life, have influenced me, I think, and kind of set me up for success in many ways when it comes to language learning. These are by no means the only hobbies that can contribute to language learning. I think really looking more holistically at our different activities, at our different interests, there's definitely a lot of ways that different skills that you've learned from different hobbies can contribute to a new hobby. So without further ado, let's jump to number one on the list. I'm going to start with something that has a very obvious link to language learning, but I'm going to hopefully approach it in a way that's a little bit different from what you're expecting. Travel. Of course, the one obvious link that travel has to language learning is that you can go to a place that actually speaks the language that you're trying to learn and use it. Be immersed in it, listen to people speaking it, speak back to people, actually have to use that language. That's the obvious link, and that's not to be discounted because that is a very, very useful way to actually practice and use a language. But the point of this video is approach and mindset. Travel can challenge you in more ways than just the concrete usage of a different language. It also builds a lot of soft skills. Even if you go to a place that speaks a different language from the one or the ones that you're learning, even if you go someplace that speaks your own language, but maybe in a very different way from how you use it in your country or your hometown. Every time you go to some place that is different, especially if it is very different from what you're used to, you are putting yourself outside of your comfort zone. You're challenging yourself. You're going to be met with some probably very confusing situations, and you're going to have to sit in the fact that you might confuse people, you might be confused, you might misunderstand, someone might misunderstand you. All of these experiences are really good practice for what it feels like when you're trying to speak in a different language. I honestly think that the one massive barrier that kept me from ever being even close to fluent in Spanish, even when I was at my absolute best in terms of my class level, was because I could not get over the embarrassment or the timidity that I had in actually using Spanish. Even when I could have had a conversation, even when I could have handled myself in a fully Spanish environment, because I was in Spain for a couple of months, and I struggled so much just to have basic conversations. It wasn't because I didn't actually know the words that I needed to use. It wasn't always because I didn't understand. It was because I constantly had this barrier that made me doubt myself, that made me overthink what I was going to, try to say, or made me think that maybe I didn't understand something, even when I probably did. When I learned French, it was in a very different way. I never took French classes. I never had that sort of university experience with French. If I had not pushed myself to learn French the way that I had, I would never have survived in France, I can tell you that. And I would not be able to call myself fluent right now if I had not pushed myself past that uncomfortableness. So even if you travel to places where you can speak your native language, you will find yourself stuck in situations that are a little bit uncomfortable, and those little steps towards accepting that, being okay with that, learning that it's okay. Even if someone gets a little bit annoyed, sometimes you will come across people who will be annoyed for no particular reason, even if you're trying and you're being respectful and you're trying your hardest. But most of the time, I would argue, even if it feels like maybe you think maybe it'll be annoying, I would argue that most of the time it's in your head and it's just you feeling uncomfortable or awkward about the situation, or them feeling uncomfortable or awkward about the situation, and it's okay. And that is just really, really useful when it comes to getting over that nervousness and that fear of being confused or confusing people that you probably will have when you're learning a new language. The next passion on this list I might share with fewer people, but I have always loved grammar. Ever since I was in elementary school and first discovered parts of speech and sentence diagramming, like I love to do a good sentence diagram still to this day. Of course, growing up, this was really revolved around English grammar, my own language, and not necessarily thinking about how that applies to other languages, even though I did learn Spanish off and on from the time that I was somewhat young as well. But then when I went to university and I started taking Spanish classes at university, I realized just how useful this was and how much of an advantage it can be with learning languages if you understand even your own language's grammar. There were several instances when my professor would try to explain something. He would either try to relate it to English grammar so that people understood more, or he was just trying to explain the Spanish grammar to people. And those explanations just clicked for me because I already knew so much about grammar, because I loved it and because it's one of my skills. I'm definitely not saying that you have to be a grammar enthusiast or grammar expert to learn a language. You absolutely can learn this as you go. You can pick up these grammatical terms and concepts as you learn a different language, but this passion of mine definitely set me up for success early, and it kind of avoided some of those hurdles that maybe other language learners have. It really does help to be a nerd. Speaking of which, one thing that you definitely know about me, if you've been following me for any amount of time, is that I love reading, and I love just stories of any sort. Movies, series, whatever format they come in, I love immersing myself in a story. This comes with a lot of soft skills, and I think some of those soft skills do overlap with a good mindset and a good approach to language learning. Specifically, there are two things that I've noticed. The first one is empathy. Being interested in experiencing something different and being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Crying with someone, laughing with someone, being excited or nervous with someone. These are all ways of accessing a different part of our brain than just what we access when we're living our own lives and experiencing our own emotions. And so much of language learning, a lot more than we might realize if we just take a class, is about empathy and is about open-mindedness and learning about the culture or the cultures that go along with a specific language. Languages don't exist in a bubble. They develop, they evolve, they change over time depending on how they're spoken, who they're spoken by, what context they're spoken in, what other things come into contact with them or with the people that speak them. Languages change, languages evolve. That's why we have different accents, that's why we have different forms of languages depending on where they're spoken and who they're spoken by. So much of that requires context and, again, open-mindedness and empathy. The second thing on my list is imagination. Enjoying stories, especially reading stories, is so useful in developing your ability to just imagine. You absolutely have to be able to disconnect yourself from your reality, from you sitting on your couch with, the sun streaming in and your cat on your lap, and put yourself in maybe a fantasy world, maybe in the mind of someone climbing a mountain, in so many other experiences than whatever you are experiencing right now. And that is definitely a soft skill. Maybe it's drawn with more of a dotted line between this and language learning, but it makes sense in my head at least. Like I said, so much about a language is wrapped up in context, in cultural context, in regional context, geographical context. There's so much there that you have to kind of disconnect yourself from whatever your actual experiences are and be able to put yourself in the mindset of somebody else and be able to imagine life, especially if you can't travel to that place right now or maybe ever. You need a little bit of that imagination to be able to make that real and to understand the reality surrounding the language, not just the grammar, not just the textbook, not just your experiences speaking that in class with other learners or with your teacher. It can give you a more well-rounded approach. Another passion that has been a part of my life since I was very, very young is for music. I started taking violin lessons when I was 5. I have always loved to sing. Anything from karaoke to, choir. When I was in university, I did choir for a while. I love to sing. And I also can play a little bit of guitar. I mostly taught myself, and my dad helped me a little bit because he played some guitar. I also learned a little bit of piano when I was quite young. Music has always been a part of my life, and I think there are many, many different ways that this has developed a good mindset for language learning. There are a lot of very concrete things about music, of course. It can be quite mathematical. If you're going to compose, if you're going to analyze music, you will get a lot more into that side of music. It's not all artistic, but what I want to really focus on is the artistic side, and that was definitely more of my experience because I never really, I did write songs, but I didn't compose like proper music and use form and theory and all of that. That really wasn't my focus. I did a lot more of the performance aspect. And one of the things that my teacher when I was a teenager really valued for her students was memorizing. And memorization is very, very useful in all areas of your life. I remember my teacher used to also tell me this because when I was a teenager, I kind of had a time period when I was not so keen on continuing violin, and the only reason I really did was because I loved orchestra and I had a lot of friends in orchestra. So that was really the only reason I kept up lessons there for a little period of time. So she used to tell me, you know, this is a skill that you can apply to everything else in life. And she was right, I gotta say. As you're learning a language and as you're becoming fluent in a language, this is going to become a lot more natural in the same way that your native language is. Well, maybe not the same way, but more similarly to how your native language is a bit more natural. But especially when you're just learning the beginning of a language, when you're learning, complex rules, also there are always exceptions to rules that you have to just memorize. And until it becomes natural, it is a little bit of a memory game. So having a lot of these skills already developed in memorizing music to perform, memorizing words to then be able to perform, use in a way that doesn't feel natural yet, is very similar. A huge aspect of learning music is also about imitation and repetition. One thing that my teacher used to do when she didn't necessarily know how to explain something, or when it maybe wasn't most efficient to explain something, is she would just play like a little passage or a few notes, whatever we were focusing on, and she would play it in the way that she wanted me to interpret, and then I would repeat it, and then she'd play it again, and I would repeat it, until I found kind of how to reproduce the same effect, the same dynamics, the same expression as what she was trying to get from me. So much about music is that. So much about music is listening to 5 different interpretations of a piece and finding those moments and then imitating and repeating and then adding your own flair to it. And that is also in a lot of ways what it's like to learn languages, especially when it comes to pronunciation. I had an experience with a student once, because I used to teach English as a foreign language very briefly, and I had a student once who was very much like a scientific mindset. And I remember he would focus so much on specifically physically what your mouth was doing to produce a sound, and I would try to have him just repeat after me, repeat the sound a few times, and it was a struggle for him because that wasn't how he had approached learning. If you've already approached this with music, you might be a little bit more naturally inclined to do that same thing. And that is the best way to learn how to pronounce, honestly, is just repeating, repeating, repeating. So I'm going to wrap it up there for today, but this is a vast, vast subject. So I would love to keep the discussion going in the comments below. Let me know if you share some of these passions with me, if you've also noticed that they may have helped you develop skills that were useful in language learning. Let me know especially if there are other things that maybe I haven't talked about today, or maybe skills that I don't have, other passions that I don't have, like painting or cooking and things like this, where it's definitely like my weak spots. But I'd love to know if there's anything that comes to mind for you in terms of what has helped you learn languages, or maybe what you think might be helpful in the future. I'm not saying that you should pick up all of these hobbies in order to learn languages. They're not necessarily the most practical uses of time if ultimately learning the language is your goal. But if you already have these interests, then maybe think about how those have helped you, the advantages that they've given you, the ways that they've set you up for success. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know if there are any other topics about language learning or similar that you'd like me to talk about in a future video. And before I stop recording for today, I would just like to do a little shout out for these earrings that I ordered a few weeks ago. They are from a seller on Etsy called Blue Bubble 123, and they are the cutest little Jammy Dodger earrings that I have ever seen. These were the first cookie that I bought when I went to the UK. It was among the absolute first things that I bought because I was so curious to try a Jammy Dodger, and I have been obsessed with them ever since. On that note, I'm gonna go. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you very soon in another video.